Hi everyone, I'm Mohana from Art of Misanthropy, and you can find me under the same handle at Instagram and all other social media channels. I'm an artist, illustrator, and art educator who has hosted over 150 workshops, and I specialize mostly in nature based illustrations and paintings. Now let's get into today's tutorial. For paper, I will be using this 250 GSM mixed media paper from Ayush paper. Because paper matters to me, this is what I'm going with. This is a very smooth and very thick paper which is perfect for all sorts of mediums. For other materials, I'll be using watercolor paints, brushes, etc. All the details will be in the description below. The flower we'll be creating today is a pansy, and for that, first of all, I'm going to start off with my pencil sketch. I've marked out roughly the center of the small piece of paper, and I'm just going ahead and drawing a few different petals as shown. I'm going to create 5 petals in total, keeping the one at the bottom the largest in size. And as you can see, I'm being very loose with the shapes, not worrying too much about being perfect, just keep them very loose. Play around with the shapes and sizes. Now I'm just lightening that sketch. Now onto the painting. I'm just adding water to part of the petal as shown, leaving part of it white and absolutely blank because that's the way the flower is going to look later on. I'm just adding some purple to that water and not in a solid layer. As you can see, we want a lot of texture, we want variation, tonal values, things like that. And I've just mixed up this purple with my French ultramarine blue and French vermilion, but you can use any kind of red and blue to mix up your purples, or if you have an existing purple in your set, you can use that as well. And I'm just adding a lot more of that ultramarine blue and darker shades of purple to certain sections of my petals to give them more texture and variety. Now, in order to create highlights and some more variation, you can go ahead and lift up color from certain areas with a damp brush. And for the largest petal at the bottom, I'm following the same steps as before. Just here, there will be a demarcation at the center as shown, just towards the middle of the petal. And I'm dropping water in first as before, and then I'm dropping in my purples and blues, just creating a lot of variation and texture and layers. With watercolor, remember, you have to work in layers, so take your time. And for that final petal, I'm just using the wet in dry technique and placing my purples, and now moving on to the center. I'm creating these large strokes with a darker purple and just pushing those towards the tops of the petals and just going ahead and adding more shadows and details. Remember, you have to be a little patient and just keep blending and keep working in layers, add more contrast, more detail, more variation like I'm doing here, and just keep blending, blending, blending. That's the key to watercolor. Add shadows, add depth, add contrast, highlights, and now back to those central sections again. Just playing around with purples, blues, darks and lights. Play around with your values, create contrast, and going back to the petals. Again, I'm just adding more detail, and I'm going to do this several times over and over again just to add variety and depth and variation. And I'm just adding these short little strokes in yellow in the center with some orange, and then back to the petals and adding more and more layers and more details. Those are the keys: variation, layer, detail. And lastly, again, these strokes in purple. I'm using a darker shade of purple, as you can see here, and again playing around with my purples and blues. I know this sounds repetitive, but that is essentially what watercolor is, especially with a piece like this where you're working with not a lot of colors. It's a very limited color palette. You just want to play with your variations, with your depth, and just keep working in layers. That's honestly the key to a piece like this. Now, depending on whether I'm using the wet and dry or wet and wet technique, I'm going to either wait for my layers to dry before I move on to the next one, or work quickly while the previous layer is still wet, just to blend it a little bit better. And just keep going back and forth, build up contrast, adding some more orange to the center, just for a pop of color. Once those layers have dried a little bit, I'm going back and adding more contrast to the center. And lastly, my final details, which are these veins. Now you can use liner brushes for these, but I'm just using my size 1 brush because I feel comfortable using it. But if you want even thinner lines or if you're not as confident, feel free to use liner brushes. I'm using purples and blues to create those veins, and lastly some more orange in the center, and just adding a light blue to that fold right there, and that is our pansy done. If you recreate this painting, be sure to tag Art of Misanthropy and Ayush Paper, and don't forget to subscribe to Ayush Paper for more such tutorials. See you guys next time.